Hello, and welcome to Opera Gallery. Thank you for joining us tonight. So we are thrilled to have you for a curator's tour of Antonio Saura, painting at will, with Alastair Smart, art critic and writer, and Xavier Bray, director of the Wallace Collection, curator of the exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery, Goya, the Portrait.
So maybe we should start with the Goya when we do move to our first painting, seeing you are the resident expert.
Okay, so I think, for me it's been a great pleasure. I cycled past Bond Street, and then when I saw this was up, I have to admit I was very surprised to see that there would be an Antonio Saura show here in Great Britain. I've just been told that the last show was 1966, so a very long time. But I grew up on Antonio Saura and El Paso group, of which she was a founding member, because my father was a journalist in Spain in the 1980s and early 90s. And there was a real sort of re-emergence of Saura's work, and he was extremely popular, and he represents in a way a sort of defiance to the Franco regime. So it's interesting to, post-Franco Spain, the fact that we've gone through so many governments now, that Saura should be re-emerging as a really important artist is very interesting. But what's also very interesting, and I think the introduction of the text here makes it very clear, is how he really drank from the artistic sources that he had before him, mainly at the Prado. And we all know that the Prado is one of the great collections of Velázquez, Goya, El Greco, and many others. And it's where Picasso was to learn very much, even though he lived most of his life in exile from Spain. He never came back to Madrid, but he was made the honorary director of the Prado. So the connection was still there. But for me, Antonio allows you to reconsider the great works by Goya. And it's amazing and fascinating that he would have been completely bewildered and fascinated by a painting that I think we all know. There's this extraordinary wall painting, do circulate it, which Goya painted towards the end of his life, in about 1819, 1820, or thereabouts. It's one of the great mysteries of his œuvre. But I think it connects very well, and something we can discuss in a minute. But Goya painted this right in the middle of tremendous repression under the reign of Ferdinand VII. Ferdinand VII was brought back following the defeat of Napoleon to Spain. The Spanish thought he was the desired king, el deseado. Having said that, he brought back the Ancien regime, he brought back the Inquisition, he brought back the divine right of kingship, and he set out his secret police, and all the liberals operating in Spain were either executed, arrested, or sent into exile. Goya was one of those liberals, but being a painter, he adapted, and he did paint portraits of Ferdinand. Ferdinand, if you look them up on the Prado website, he looks like a completely pompous arse, I'm afraid, standing like this. Looks very pleased. He almost has the red tie and the blue suit and the white shirt and the twist. You know who I'm describing, but very, very narcissistic figure. But Goya painted him. Having said that, in private, Goya was a very different person, and he acquired this country house just outside Madrid called the Quinta del Sordo, the House of the Deaf Man. Weirdly, it had been the house that had belonged to a deaf man, even though Goya at this stage was also deaf. And he buys it and decorates it. He paints the ground floor and the upper floor. And one of those paintings, amongst many others, which show witchcraft scenes, fights, duels, ghouls, and all kinds of horrific, nightmarish images, is this dog. A dog that appears to be struggling, head out, looking upwards, and again, we don't know how to interpret it. It really is anybody's guess, but it looks like quicksand. That's how I sort of imagined it. Quicksand or water or sort of sand that's coming down the hill, and that dog is being, little by little, slowly being engulfed by it, almost in a sort of pitiless way. And interesting that Antonio should spend so much time looking at it and reworking it in this sort of series of paintings.
I'm going to bring in a little bit of biographical info. I think in the early 40s he was maybe 12, 13, he contracted tuberculosis, which put him he was incapacitated for something like 5 years thereafter in bed. He only got to know the world through art and through books, I should say. And I'm wondering if you think part of the reason why he was so attracted to Goya's work wasn't just, the aesthetic, if you like, but also because he's found some sort of affinity with Goya. Of course, Goya becoming deaf and contracting that illness later in life, and whether you think there's any connection there between the two.
I think definitely at this stage of his life, Goya did feel isolated. His friends had all left and lived in Bordeaux or in France. He had just been extremely ill. He nearly died in 1819 and was miraculously saved by his doctor, Dr. Arrieta, and there's this famous self-portrait of him lying back in the arms of his doctor. And I like to think that illness is what inspired him to leave this mark in the form of the black paintings, as they're known. I'm sure he went down that tunnel of death. I'm sure he experienced that near-death experience. But he probably also had a sort of vision of the dark, nightmarish Spain that was being, executed at the time under Ferdinand's regime. And Ferdinand and Franco, I think, are very interesting images. So I think, yes, the illness, the fact that he spent 5 years almost in isolation, the fact that he could associate himself with Goya and that sort of psychological state, there's no doubt that perhaps he picked the dog as that sort of cry for help, cry for despair. What's interesting, though, is the fact that he's leveled out that quicksand that you see in the Goya, which is a strong diagonal, here is on a flat surface, as if it's floating in the water. And then the more you look at it, you can sort of start seeing the dog and the ears, perhaps. But it's an abstraction of that form, which is interesting. And I was wondering where that came from.
I'm thinking also the context, so specifically Spanish context. We talked about the parallel between Ferdinand and Franco, but also the context, geopolitical context at the time he started painting. I think this is a later version, but he started working on in the late 50s, I think. So at the time, it's around the same time as Bacon and Giacometti, and this whole period of like post-war existential angst, and this idea of the sort of the individual, how he's coming to terms with the world after the Holocaust, essentially. And I'm thinking that maybe Goya's dog, in some way, he thought as a prototype, if you like, for the individual in that context. A little, one might say, as you've used the crucified Christ, but we'll come on to that in a second.
No, I mean, the dog, what's interesting is that, yes, it's on its own. I mean, the black paintings, from a purely art historical point of view, those paintings were left by Goya, and then he went off to Bordeaux and lived in sort of self-imposed exile. He left the house to his son. The house was pretty much locked up. Nobody got to see it until a French property developer acquired it in the 1870s, bought the house, took it down, but took the paintings off, amazingly, took them to Paris, where they were shown at the Exposition Universelle, and then were put on long-term loan at the Prado. So they don't actually belong to the Spanish government. They do not belong to the Prado. They belong still to that family, but on long-term loan. But the moment they took them off the wall, they got very damaged. And so what Antonio Saura was looking at, and what we are still looking at, are actually wall paintings that have been substantially damaged and repainted at a later date. And the big thing to do, and the Prado should be doing it, is using the very old photographs that survive to reconstruct the differences between what the paintings looked like when Goya did them and what they look like after restoration. Interestingly, when I looked up the black and white photograph of the dog, it was very much like we see it now, except that the color scheme looks different. And so what we recognize as quicksand and so on might be different. But I wanted to read you a letter, if I can find it, written by Goya's very good friend who was waiting for him in Bordeaux. And Goya's decided to leave Spain. He can't take it any longer. He's left this masterpiece for whoever's going to see it. So it's a very private piece. But he writes, this description of him arriving is quite special in a way, because it captures him in a sort of most very frail state, very fragile, and maybe that's something that Antonio Saura are associated with. So Goya arrived deaf, old, tired and weak, and without knowing a word of French, and without bringing a servant, and no one needs one more than he, and so happy and desirous of seeing the world, he stayed here for 3 days, and on 2 of them he ate with us like a young student. I advised him, and he wanted to go to Paris. I advised him to return from Paris by September and not to stay in that city and be overcome by the winter there, which could be the death of him. So it's amazing that that journey is replicated by Antonio Saura. He spends, how long did he spend in Paris?
He was back and forth, but I think the interesting thing is that he did very much, he returned to Spain. I know Goya was old, so he then ended up staying in France and dying there. But there are certainly those parallels.
I mean, we like to romanticize Goya's self-imposed exile, but actually he wanted to draw on his royal pension, so he came back to Madrid twice, right. Aged 78 and 80. Which is extraordinary. We all forget about that. But when you look at the documentation, he actually was keen to come back to Spain. But unlike Picasso, it is interesting that Antonio would come backwards and forwards. And I wonder, I mean, this is a question for you, whether he would bring back the sort of liberal avant-garde ideas back into Spain as a sort of quiet sense of protest, perhaps?
Quietly, yes. I also think, certainly. I also think there was clearly a tension there between what was allowed under Franco's regime, in terms of artistic sort of expression and freedom. There's perhaps a general sense that, as an autocratic regime, that there was absolutely no freedom of expression whatsoever. I think it was a lot more complex and nuanced than that. And Saura and the El Paso group found a way almost around the censors. Sort of veering towards abstraction was one obvious way of doing that. You're not painting clearly figurative objects which might or might not be pro or contra a regime at a given time. I also think that, from what I've been reading, that Franco's regime were a little bit, they allowed certain things to go. They weren't completely shutting down all forms of artistic expression. And I think Saura found that sweet spot of, okay, we're going to make our protests, we're going to be innovative, we're going to progress Spanish art, because he was very much involved with Spanish art history. As we know, we've got Goya as one point of reference. We're going to come on to the Velázquez in a second. But his version of art informel, if you like, which he picked up in the Paris time, the French version of ABEX, if you like, abstract expressionism, his spin on it was to infuse it with Spanish, very traditional cultural references. And my take on that is that he was almost, Franco and his regime wanted to appropriate certainly religion, we'll come on to that, Catholic religion for themselves, and Saura's, his form of quiet, use your word, protest if you like, was to reappropriate it for the avant-garde and say, no, Goya is ours, Velázquez is ours, Spanish cultural history is ours, you're not having that, generalissimo. That's just
no, it's interesting. And I think there was a moment when I think Franco and his ministers were trying to get Picasso back.
Yes.
As a sense of, of showing that actually Spain was open to modern ideas, and I'm sure there was a moment where they needed to bring in tourism, for example, in order to survive economically and not be an isolated European country. And maybe Saura was the sort of ambassador between the avant-garde in Paris and what was going on in Spain. But you're right, I mean, this image is based on a very famous painting by Velázquez, which you will see in every church and convent in Spain, with a little prayer. It's very much the archetypal image of the Crucifixion that Velázquez painted for a small chapel in a church, convent church in Madrid, during the I think it was actually during the Spanish Civil War. It was taken out of that church and put in, and which is quite interesting actually. I hadn't made that link before, and taken out and placed at the Prado, where it could be seen by the public. Out of a sacred space as such. But the more sort of right-wing Catholic regime definitely adored it as one of the key pictures, and an easy one to comprehend. If you look at it very carefully, and if you're into your Spanish iconography, most of the time when you look at Michelangelo's Crucifixion, you'll see it's 3 nails with 1 nail for the 2 feet. A little detail, but with Velázquez and the Spanish Catholics of the 17th century, they really believed that Christ was crucified with 4 nails and 2 in each foot, and that's why you have this very strong vertical. Now, I don't know what Saura does actually. Sorry, annoyingly, he doesn't have the feet there, unless you're meant to think that that cross below is there. But he does take on the crucifix, and as you say, makes it his own. I mean, it is a sort of universal image of pain, and you do have the crown of thorns, interestingly, on top. That's been inscribed or incised into the black paint. You've got his hands, presumably, almost like a sort of identity piece of placing them on either side, with, interestingly the stigmata, the holes in the flesh. And then you've got this extraordinary contorted face. I mean, this is where, for me, it's almost tribal. It's almost sort of African art, or it's a mixture of Pollock with Picasso, and then this real sort of cool energy that comes out. And the dripping paint almost looks like teeth, and the nose has been pushed to the side, the one eye up, one eye down. It's a bit like Guernica. It's got the same kind of colour scheme as the Guernica painting. I don't know if he's playing on that or not. But it's a tremendous image, which I think, be religious, if you're religious or not, it still transcends its power. And it'd be amazing to do one day a show of all his crucifixions in one room to see how different they are, because they do vary, don't they, in their approach.
And I gather he only spent like no more than one day on any given painting. He had it all sort of mapped out in his head before he started and completed it, and then he wasn't one of these artists, I don't think, who sort of reworked, left it for 5 years and then came back or anything like that.
But he did lots of drawings. I mean, he was extremely skilled. When you see him draw, he does it with incredible speed.
So maybe we could talk about the palette with this one. We haven't talked about his colour palette yet, which is very, very Spanish.
There is a sort of movement, particularly towards the end of the 19th century Spain, known as España Negra, the Black Spain, the Spain of superstition, of magic, of witchcraft. And there was a whole literary set that really sort of delved into that side, and therefore there was quite a few painters, mainly Basque painters, Solana and others, who painted in this very dark, almost oily, over-oiled paint. And I wonder if that's something that he takes up. Despite the black and the greys, there is this sort of beigey, pinkish colour, which brings warmth into the picture. And you see it particularly with the dog, and actually he goes for even darker brown. So yes, there is a strong sort of what we call grisaille, the black and white and the greys, but at the same time, surprisingly, the more you look at them, you see that it's not just those sort of different shades of grey. It's actually quite... he does want to breathe a bit of life into the compositions. But I mean, when I see these, I do think more of Pollock and his black and white kind of pictures. But
I think he was very plugged into the international avant-garde, wasn't he? I think he thought of himself as bringing that back into Spain, but using his Spanish cultural heritage as almost a kicking off point for him. Saura called the Goya painting the most beautiful painting in the world. Joan Miró, I think, pretty much his last visit to Madrid, was taken to the Prado and asked the director of the Prado, take me to see Goya's dog. Forget everything else that's in the museum, I want to see that before I die, essentially. So it's clearly means it's a painting that means a lot to a lot of masterly painters.
The Prado have not paid homage to Saura for a very long time. Miguel Zugasta, who's now in Bilbao, would have loved this. I mean, he would love this show. And he was much more tuned into the El Paso group and how important they were. And, you see it in Italy, Arte Povera is having a re-emergence. So, things are cyclical. But El Paso, if you go to Cuenca and see the museum, it's absolutely fantastic place. I mean, you should take all of these people to El Paso, to Cuenca. Have you been there, to Cuenca? Oh, well, you must go to Cuenca. It's the most extraordinary, as a sort of artistic colony. I mean, this is the other interesting thing is, maybe as you know a bit more about the whole group of El Paso, but the great cities, artistic cities in Spain, definitely Madrid, Toledo, Barcelona, maybe Seville, or yes, definitely Seville. But Cuenca is this amazing town on the way to Valencia. It's perched up on a hill. It's very beautiful. And it's astonishing that they should decide that this is the place. And it's the middle of nowhere. The landscape is quite arid. But to choose Cuenca as a sort of place for a cultural re-emergence is very interesting in itself. And I think that must be to do with Saura's understanding of the Spanish geography. Geography is very important in Spain. Maybe it was a region that during Franco's time was, it's not far from Aragon, and Aragon was very republican and resisted the Spanish nationalist party for quite a long time. So there might be a geographical reason why he decided to set up the Paso group there.
And Goya was also from Aragon, was it? It's another
That's
connection
right,
we haven't drawn upon yet. Just yet another parallel there. Yeah.
That's true. Well, last time I went to Cuenca was to get to Fuendetodos,
Fantastic.
where Goya was born, which is in the middle of nowhere in Aragon. Yeah. This I was very impressed by because I don't know. I mean, in terms of portraiture, it reminded me a lot of the Velázquez Las Meninas, the Infanta. And when you look at these, it's the paintiness. It's just superb the way he drags the brush and the spatula, and then you get this sort of big bit of impasto here and here as well. And the way he draws the paint across the canvas and then digs back to bring back the canvas so you can see the raw canvas coming through here. I mean, that's Velázquez loved using the ground of the canvas. So, you know, he's definitely not just looking at the imagery, he's looking at the execution, the way things are actually painted. And I think that's also very refreshing to see an artist who loves his materials as such. He's a great technician from that point of view. These are very strange. I find them very primeval, almost sort of African, and there's a sort of almost sort of, animal-like in their expression, and I can't tell what the eyes, nose, the mouth is, but yeah, I can see that they're teeth. But the more I'm completely taken aback by them, I like the way they've been hung side by side, where you get different viewpoints, slightly closer, slightly further away, against this black mass in the background that pushes it forward. And here, you know, it really is black and white with maybe a touch of a mixed paint to bring that grey out. But I do find them incredibly powerful. And I guess, I mean, I don't see Velázquez like that one over there. I don't see Goya really, but I do see weirdly El Greco, and you might think it's a bit strange, but Greco did, he's famous for his elongated figures, his religious images, but he was also a great portraitist, and he did do close-up portraits of men of his time, usually with a lovely sort of goatee beard, bald head, but done with incredible expression. And they're also black and white because they got these amazing ruffs and wearing black. And I don't know if it's one way of thinking about these pictures. So maybe he is working with El Greco here. I nearly missed this bit, but luckily I was told to come down here. And on one side you've got the Auto da Fes, which is a really interesting theme which we could look at maybe as we end. But I was really taken back by these what they call crowds. And crowds is a really interesting concept for Spanish culture. I remember when I first went to Spain, I was told the Spanish people don't like being on their own much. They like to be in cuadrilla, which is like a group activities. They like to go on processions. They like to go to church. You know, it's a sense of they're very together, and that's why families are strong and so on. But crowds also can be feared. I mean, when the crowd goes in the wrong direction, it can be quite frightening. And I don't know if Saura was looking into the concept of the crowd, but there are the most astonishing sketches that he's then cut up and collaged, but with what you can sort of see is heads all together, and this sort of agglomeration of people. And it really made me think of this extraordinary drawing, which is actually at the Fitzwilliam Museum by Goya. Goya did this amazing pit. I think it's a pit. I think it's a sort of big pit of lots of little heads of figures all thrown into this hole. And panic, and people sort of suddenly wanted to get out, but this sort of madness that goes with it. And it really reminded me of these astonishing drawings, which I have to admit I find very psychologically disturbing. But Alastair, you might see them in a very different way.
I missed that. I missed that reference. I was thinking more of that sort of 50s, the Porritt, Riopelle type period, 50s avant-garde. But it's interesting. I'm sure it was all in the mix with Saura. He was so sort of well read. And well versed.
I mean, yeah, he had an extraordinary library, and I presume the foundation still has his books, his letters.
He was a writer as well as a painter, and illustrated lots of wonderful books up there with his illustrations.
I mean, this is a good installation, the idea of the crowd watching on this awful sort of day of judgment that usually happened in the Plaza Mayor in Madrid. So even though we now take our photographs and enjoy the beautiful scenery, it was used as a stage to set up these moments for the Inquisition to judge and execute. And I don't know how these work, whether they're general shapes that allude to that big piazza, the way that the square would have been opened up, and they would have a special podium where they would bring the heretics, and they would dress them up with conical hats as heretics, as penitents. But they must be a way of touching on what was going on under Franco. I mean, the fact that the Catholic Church.
I think absolutely right. I think they clearly again parallels between what he saw as his era and the historic past. So the Spanish Inquisition as a sort of he didn't want that to be relived under Franco's time. And I think the fact that these are made there with book covers of different kinds, that was his sort of starting material. And the Inquisition famously, as well as doing all sorts of other things, burnt thousands of Hebrew Bibles and Maya codices and things like that. So clearly that idea is very much part of it, given the name of the series, Auto de Fe, obviously. Do you think, given that Franco died in 75 and Saura outlived him by 20 plus years, do you see a positivity in some of his later works, or do you think he was just so sort of influenced by having lived under those dark times that he continued to the end, and he lived in fear that they might return potentially?
Yeah. No, I think he definitely found his voice and his style.
Yeah.
And I think for any painter it's always difficult to sort of change that much. But I'm sure that there was a moment in the 1980s where it was important to be reminded and to keep. So I think his paintings became references to the past, even though they were in the present that was far more liberal. And I think the identity of it, there's a very strong identity in his art, and I think he must have decided to keep that until his very last days. But interestingly, he went into film and different art forms, and theatre and stage sets as well. So I think he definitely wanted to. I mean, it reminded me of how boring one is today when you see what Antonio was able to achieve and the connections he made. And I think it must have been something that Goya never saw, really. I mean, he would have seen it in France, in Paris, in the last years of his life, but he never saw the return of a liberal regime, basically. Yeah. So I'm sure that in Saura there must have been a great sense of relief and creative spirit, really, and hence he engaged with all kind of art forms in the last years of his life. With Velázquez, I mean, we know very little about what Velázquez thought, and he didn't write. But we know from the inventory of his household goods that he had a fantastic library, and had Plutarch, Vasari, Palladio books. I mean, he really appeared to be a highly intellectual. Now, whether it was for show, and some people like to have libraries to sort of, but they haven't read anything. I don't know. I think he must have been very well read. He travelled to Italy on 2 occasions. He knew lots of people, and part of his whole career was to try and be not just a painter that got his hands dirty. He wanted to exalt his art form and be the intellectual painter. So I think with Velázquez, for sure, I think he was definitely keen to be that person. And indeed, as a career at the court, he almost gave up painting and became a curator, a buyer, a fixer, organising of special festivities and so on. So different art forms, but not dissimilar in a way.
We tend to know less, of course.
Yeah. So I think if Velázquez had been living in the time of Saura, I'm sure he would have engaged with that. And with Goya, very likely the same. And Goya, I wouldn't say he was a super intellectual, but he was very interested in ideas and political ideas. He had his friendships were with poets and writers. His caprichos, his wonderful series of etchings, which are caricatures of Spanish society, are very learned and very witty. But I think his intelligence came from engaging with people. And in Spain you have this wonderful tradition of dichos, of sayings, that are very witty but very truthful. And I think he was very quick-witted. And I think he was somebody who'd just pick things up. So he wouldn't go to books, but he would just be very good at observing and taking a lot of... and I think for many intellectuals at the time, he was one of these people who was able to put in visual form complex literary and intellectual ideas and reveal the truth about society. And that's why that dog is important, because I think it's almost Goya's desperation that humans can't now, he can't paint humans to tell you a story, he has to get a dog to tell you that story that will connect with us, which sometimes you have to. We're being for it now, we're being so horrible to us, each other, but sometimes it takes an animal to wake us up, and that despair in that dog is quite something. It's a curious story. Goya was buried in Bordeaux, and he wanted to be buried there. He wrote it down. But when Spain were now deciding to celebrate Goya's genius, they decided to bring his body back to Madrid. And when they opened the tomb, they found that his skull was missing. The theory is that there was this freaky guy who felt that he had to find all the geniuses' skulls to study them, to sort of demonstrate that a genius has a different shaped skull. So phrenologists, is that what they're called? But we don't know for sure. But the skull appears to have been found in the 1850s by a painter who made a portrait of the skull, and then the skull disappeared, so it's lost. But there is this painting in the Museum of Saragossa. It was a long time in storage, it might still be in storage, of Goya's skull, so said to be Goya's skull, and it just looks like any skull that you would think a skull looks like. But yeah, that's the story. So in Madrid, when you go and pay homage to Goya's tomb, you need to be mindful that the head is not there. It's somewhere lost. So it's a bit of a sad story. Whether Antonio Saura knew this, I don't know. He must have known that story. I don't know. But actually, it might be worth doing a bit of research in the archive.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Excellent.